Hi everyone, it is Dr. Z. We are here for the Enlightenment Part 2. We're going to start with discussion of the philosophes. So these were influential intellectuals or philosophers, mainly in France, mainly in Paris. And you may ask, why was this French? And the Enlightenment really starts in France and is really considered a big part of French history. And the Enlightenment itself is rather French. French was the international language of the educated class. France was the wealthiest country. There was rising unpopularity of the French monarchy. The elite is discontent, right? You learned about the Fronde. There was less censorship in France. So what was published could be disseminated more without so much. It doesn't say that there was no censorship, but there was less, right? So more things could be published there. And they had what was called the Republic of Letters. So this is an imagined transnational realm from the Renaissance in which critical thinkers and writers participated. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but that is one reason as well as to why the Enlightenment was French. So one of the first philosophers we'll talk about is a man named Montesquieu. He wrote a number of different books. One is the Persian Letters. This was a fictional account of two imagined Persian travelers who were looking at European customs in a unique way, right? So Montesquieu could criticize European customs because he was speaking from an outsider's perspective. Another book that he wrote was The Spirit of the Laws, and this compares Great Britain, right, in its constitutional monarchy with the Roman Republic. So it's a political science book on what is a republic, what is a monarchy, what is despotism. And it really, is a foundational text in political theory and political science. This, The Spirit of the Laws was inspired by Louis XIV's absolutism. Catherine the Great saw herself as an enlightened absolutist because she read this book. The book influenced the framers of both the U.S. and the French constitutions. And it's famous for really elaborating on the idea of what is the separation of powers by checks and balances in a government. Voltaire is another philosophe from France. He believed in deism. So deism is the idea that God creates the universe just like a clockmaker creates a clock. And then he steps back and just watches the universe run, and that he doesn't have a hand in the everyday aspects of what's happening in the world. So as such, Voltaire, right, believed in God but didn't believe in religion. And he wanted religious tolerance. He thought that religion caused a lot of issues between people. He also wrote the Philosophical Letters Concerning the English Nation, which, like Montesquieu's book, instead compares British and French society. And Voltaire is French, but he favors the British way of governing. And this is such an early text in the Enlightenment. In 1734, it's seen as sort of one of the founding books of the Enlightenment. He also wrote a really interesting novel called Candide. And if you read anything from Enlightenment primary sources, this would be a great one for you to look at. You could probably knock it out in less than a day. It's a short novel where a young man travels around, I believe it's like the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal, if I remember correctly. It's been since college since I read it. And then he ends up traveling to South America. And there's like a story of El Dorado in there. And it's basically criticizing everything that he sees in modern society and sort of gives like a perspective. In the same way of the Persian Letters, Candide is similar to that, challenging despotism, challenging the church, challenging religion. And it's also just a really interesting and fun story to read. He communicated with Frederick the Great of Prussia, who also saw himself as an enlightened absolutist. And he accepted Frederick's invitation to come to the Prussian court in Berlin. When Voltaire died, this is a drawing of his funeral. You see Voltaire's bust in the middle here on a stage, and people are dancing, and what they are singing at the time is "Voltaire taught us to be free." And actually, if you go back to the other slide, this is his funeral procession through the streets of Paris. So he was very beloved philosopher at the time. Thomas Paine is a British thinker who upheld deism. And made it appeal to the masses. He challenged the legitimacy of the Bible. He saw the Bible as ordinary literature. And in this quote that you see above here, you can hear his I would call it sarcasm, his tone as he thinks about biblical stories. He says, the person they called Jesus Christ, begotten, they say, by a ghost, whom they call holy, on the body of a woman engaged in marriage and afterwards married, and whom they call a virgin 700 years after this foolish story were told, were any girl that is now with child to say that she was gotten with child by a ghost and that an angel told her so, would she be believed? Right? So he's sort of taking the idea of religion to task, right? Upholding the idea of God through deism, but not religion. Age of Reason is a bestseller in the United States, and the British government thought that it would cause a revolution. They banned the book. And, you know, his whole idea is that reason should take the place of revelation, right? That you should think logically about God's world and not get your ideas from a book. And that's sort of the very core of what deism is all about. He wrote in the vernacular, so he wrote the way that people spoke. He wanted people to be able to read and understand his work. He, quote, took deism out of the hands of the intellectuals and gave it to the masses. So the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopedia. And this you can kind of think of as like the Wikipedia of the Enlightenment period. It literally is an encyclopedia. It's a book compiled by many different people that's seen as the greatest achievement of the philosophes collectively. It was completed in 1766. There are 72,000 articles written by people from all over Europe, scientists, writers, skilled workers, progressive priests. Lots of people contributed to this in the same way that people contribute to Wikipedia today. So science was exalted, religion was questioned. There's articles on non-European cultures. They acknowledged Muslim contributions to science in that scientific revolution, and it was widely read. And when you open up the slideshow, you'll see a link to the encyclopedia. You could read it in English. You can see the drawings in it. And I encourage you to pop around and read a few of the entries because they're really just a wonderful way to be a fly on the wall in the 18th century. They have very mundane things in the encyclopedia. For example, here's a drawing of a tennis court, which is the location of a very important moment in the French Revolution, which we will talk about, which is why I put that in there today for you. They have tools that were used at the time, and even quills, pens, right, that were used for writing and the different shapes of them. And my favorite one is the powdered wigs, different illustrations of different hairstyles and wigs that were used. And then, of course, there's also lots of articles that are written in prose that explain all sorts of different concepts. So this all sort of leads us to what is called the reading revolution. And this is part of what historians call Enlightenment on the ground, meaning how was the Enlightenment experienced by the everyday person? So literacy rates rose as we learned the idea of censorship was lessened in France. There were lending libraries where you could borrow books or at least go in and read the books that you didn't own. The Republic of Letters, okay, is this idea of intellectual discussion through writing letters to each other and learning through a discussion of letters. There was a competent post system, right? So you could literally physically mail a letter between Paris and Moscow, right? And any place in between. So people were able to communicate with each other. Now you can imagine it would take a very long time for them to arrive, but it did exist. And within France itself, their post system was really beyond compare at the time. Enlightenment spaces of coffee houses, theaters, salons, which we'll talk about in the next slide, and libraries are also examples of sort of this Enlightenment on the ground. So people would experience the Enlightenment through salons. A salonière was a woman who, would host a salon in her house. There's a quote here from Dina Goodman's book on the Enlightenment that says, "The salonières were not social climbers, but intelligent, self-educated, and educating women who adopted and implemented the values of the Enlightenment Republic of Letters and used them to reshape the salon to their own social, intellectual, and educational needs." And a salonière would be a broker of the Enlightenment. They would have a writer come to their salon in their house. The writer would read something that they wrote to a group of people, and the salonière could connect that writer to publishers. So they very much were literary agents, and they were seen as sort of helping along the Enlightenment. So aristocrats have always brought poets and writers and artists to their courts, right? Lured by patronage, right? Where the aristocrats would pay, we learned about patrons in the Renaissance, right? They're paying for portraits or paying for paintings to be made. Souvenirs did not pay for the writers to come, right? They were brokers. They were like literary agents for the people. A salon lacked a social hierarchy. There were mixed social ranks of noble and bourgeois folks, and also men and women in the same room. And this was a space, Dana Goodman, suggests, that was very much run by women. And that is unique in and of itself. So these salons really were institutions of the Enlightenment. Another institution of the Enlightenment is the Noble Lending Library, right? So in the 18th century, there were more than 20,000 titles. And some libraries and some smaller libraries had maybe about 200. Some offered subscriptions. Others published books. Of 1,000 books published, 400 would go to lending libraries. In England, they helped women publish a lot of fiction. And they were criticized for promoting this new genre called the novel. And the criticism was that novels enabled people to have unrealistic expectations of life, which I don't know, I find that pretty funny. Likewise, on the ground in the Enlightenment is coffee houses. So these were called penny universities. They had newspapers and conversation with other intellectual folks. Journalists would come. They were called runners, with the latest news. And some of these coffee houses you can visit today. I'll slip to this next slide really quick. This is Cafe Florian in Venice, and there I am with my husband. This is the oldest coffee shop in Italy, and it's still running. If you go to England, the Queen's Lane Coffee House in Oxford was opened in 1754 and is still open. And the idea is that the stimulant of coffee would give people better conversation than they would have with alcohol. And of course, this leads to the development of financial markets, newspapers, political groups. It was a public space for people to meet. And Habermas, who writes all about the public sphere, says the public realm is a space where men could escape from their roles as subjects and gain autonomy in the exercise and exchange of their own opinions and ideas, right? So again, this is, you are more of an individual. It's about the rise of the individual. And these were not places where women would be. And women complained that coffee houses provided in times of domestic crisis when a husband should have been attending to his duties at home. They also complained that coffee made men sterile, which again is pretty humorous. Okay, one last bit on the Enlightenment on the ground, and that is the Freemasons. They held meetings in Masonic temples. Where elite people and commoners could meet together, and they created their own social hierarchy of tenure within the organization. So you might have somebody in the Masonic temple who was a farmer, but who held a higher position than perhaps a noble person who was in the same temple. So, this was another example of the Enlightenment on the ground, and historians often point to the Masonic temples as a place where people practiced democracy before the revolutions in the United States and in France. All right, we will stop there. Thank you.